I lost power right as I was telling the board of directors that our pilot grid expansion project had just hit 98% completion. I was sitting in my home office, sipping coffee, looking at a monitor showing real-time diagnostics of our substation's upgraded circuit breakers, when every single screen in my house went black. A second later, the AC groaned to a halt. I glanced outside, confused. The weather was clear, no storms, no sudden surges. My backup system should have already kicked in, until I noticed something strange on the front lawn. A woman with a neon orange vest she clearly made at home using reflective tape was holding a pair of bolt cutters and grinning like she'd just won a game show. That woman, of course, was Karen. Now, when I say Karen, I don't mean some mild suburban busybody. I mean a full-blown, weaponized homeowner who thought HOA meant she had absolute dominion over every tree, shrub, and utility pole within visual range. She was the self-appointed vice president of the board, a title she created, and the loudest voice in every meeting. She'd once fined a neighbor for using unapproved brick tones on a chimney that was over 20 years old. Her newest mission was cracking down on what she called grid defiance, which, apparently, meant not using the overpriced HOA electricity contractor she got kickbacks from. I opened the front door calmly and walked out to greet her. She stood proudly next to the open utility box, bolt cutters dangling from one hand like a trophy. "Afternoon," I said, keeping my voice level. "Having a bit of fun, are we?" She gave a self-satisfied laugh, flicking her bangs out of her eyes with the kind of flair usually reserved for courtroom dramas. "You've violated community compliance code. We've warned you multiple times to reroute your power through HOA-authorized services. You didn't. So we had to take action." "You had to cut a live power line?" I asked. She waved it off like I'd just questioned her favorite cookie recipe. "Standard procedure. You're lucky we didn't remove the transformer altogether." I leaned forward slightly and looked down at the mess of exposed cables. "Karen, do you have any idea what you just did?" "I restored order," she said, lifting her chin. "You're setting a bad example. All this independent power nonsense, it makes people think they can just ignore the HOA." "That's because I can ignore the HOA," I replied flatly. Her eyes narrowed. "You think just because you've got solar panels and a fancy storage unit in your shed that you're above the rules?" "No," I said, walking over to inspect the damage. "I think I'm above you specifically." "That's not the same thing." She actually scoffed. "You'll be fined, obviously. And your power will remain disconnected until you comply." "Karen," I said, turning to face her squarely, "what you've just done is felony utility tampering. And depending on how this plays out, possibly criminal endangerment." She didn't flinch. "No jury will convict me. I did this under HOA authority." "You're very confident in your legal expertise for someone wearing pajama pants with flamingos on them." She bristled, but the moment was already slipping away from her. I could see the flicker of hesitation cross her face. But she doubled down, muttering something about how I'd brought this on myself, and should have just followed the rules like everyone else. I walked back inside, flicked open the radio transmitter I keep in the cabinet for field operations, and tuned into the company channel. "This is Site Echo," I said casually. "We've got a tampering incident at Residential Grid 77B. Requesting isolated blackout from node upstream. Also, alert inspection and legal. Tag for escalation." A crackle came back through the line. "Confirmed. Isolation in process. Grid 77B going dark." I walked to the window and watched as, one by one, the lights across the HOA street went out like dying fireflies. Houses that once glowed with refrigerated comfort suddenly found themselves as powerless as mine. Karen was halfway across the lawn when her phone, presumably running the HOA's overpriced energy usage app, lit up in alarm. She spun in place, looking toward her house, just in time to see her porch light flicker and die. Then came the best part, her scream. It wasn't the scream of pain or terror. It was the kind of shriek only someone with a deep-rooted entitlement complex could produce. The kind that meant she just realized the power she thought she wielded didn't extend as far as she imagined. She turned and stormed back toward my house, fists clenched. "You turned off the entire neighborhood." "Actually," I said, watching my own solar backup system flick back online as programmed, "I didn't do anything. The system did. You just tripped a flag by cutting the line. But you're back online. Because my system is legal. Yours is not. It's not my fault the rest of the neighborhood can't keep up." She stood there seething, and for once, with no comeback. The silence was sweet. I didn't gloat. I just watched her process the fact that the person she thought she'd shut down had just turned the tables, and she didn't even know how deep the trap went yet. Because the real fun? That was just beginning. Karen came stomping up my driveway like she was on her way to personally unplug the sun. Her face was the color of boiled shrimp, her fists balled so tight I could practically hear her acrylic nails cracking. Behind her, the rest of the neighborhood was slowly realizing they'd just lost power, too. Garage doors were frozen halfway open, smart doorbells stopped glowing, and a few residents stood blinking on their porches, phones in hand, wondering why their ACs had just choked to death in 95-degree heat. I leaned casually against the porch railing, sipping an iced coffee, which, thanks to my independent solar system and backup battery, was still humming happily inside my fridge. Karen noticed. Of course she did. "How the hell do you have power?" she barked, marching right up to me like I owed her an answer for physics itself. "I built my system legally, Karen. With permits, inspections, grid-synced cutoff. I told you that when you demanded I dismantle it." She waved a dismissive hand. "You're lying. You must have illegally tapped into something. Otherwise, why did everyone else lose power when I cut yours?" I didn't respond. I just let the question hang in the air while she fumed. That's the thing about people like her. They need immediate answers because they can't stand the possibility that they don't know something. But Karen was about to discover she didn't just lack information. She was in completely over her head. She turned and gestured wildly toward the street. "You cut off Mrs. Jensen's dialysis machine." I raised an eyebrow. "Mrs. Jensen is at her daughter's all week in Phoenix. She mentioned it when I delivered her groceries yesterday." Karen's mouth opened, then snapped shut. Her argument collapsed on itself with a soft, pathetic pop. "Besides," I added, "I didn't shut off the neighborhood. The utility did." "You called them." "Of course I did. You tampered with a registered node. You think nobody monitors these lines? The moment your bolt cutters hit copper, it triggered an anomaly alert." Her face twisted in disbelief. "You're saying this is all automated?" "No," I said. "I'm saying it's smarter than you." She looked like she might spontaneously combust. She spun around and started dialing furiously on her phone. I could hear bits of her shouting into the receiver, words like emergency board meeting, and property violation, and immediate disciplinary action. I knew she was trying to whip the HOA into a frenzy. I also knew it wouldn't help. Half an hour later, several HOA members gathered on the sidewalk. Some of them looked angry, but not at me. Their phones were dead. Their security systems offline. One guy couldn't even get his Tesla out of the garage. They all turned to Karen, the architect of their discomfort. She waved them toward my house like I was the villain in some Disney Channel original movie. A few followed. Most didn't. Karen stepped forward, now flanked by her two most loyal cronies. Bob, a retired dentist who once suggested banning Halloween decorations because they encouraged sorcery, and Linda, who believed birds were government drones unless they wore tiny leashes. "You have one chance," Karen said, jabbing a finger at my chest. "Restore power now, or we'll fine you, sue you, and possibly have your home condemned." "Condemned?" I repeated, laughing. "Karen, the only thing getting condemned around here is your understanding of municipal law." She ignored me. "This entire block is under HOA jurisdiction. You're not allowed to operate an independent power system. Wrong again, I said. Your HOA charter specifically excludes interference with legally permitted infrastructure regulated by a state-certified utility authority. Which I have. In writing. Then we'll go above them, she spat. You'd have to go pretty high, I said, seeing as I sit on the board. They all blinked at me. Karen looked like someone had dropped a piano on her. Bob coughed. You're lying, she said, but this time with less conviction. You're just a resident. I've seen your mail. You're nobody. I'm a regional grid development advisor for Pinnacle Utilities, I said calmly. Been with them for 12 years. My name is on the project that modernized half the substations in this district, including the one feeding this neighborhood. Silence. Linda squinted. Wait, Pinnacle? The new power meters? Those were you. I nodded. Yep. Even helped write the compliance protocols, including the ones that cut power to neighborhoods when unauthorized tampering is detected. Karen's voice cracked. That's a conflict of interest. No, it's just really poor timing on your part. She looked around, seeking support, but her backup dancers had started inching away, pretending to check their phones even though they clearly had no signal. I'll call the mayor, she said, practically choking on the words. I'll call the news. This is abuse. That would be a fascinating angle for the press, I said. Local HOA cuts power, resident survives with private backup, HOA leader outraged that consequences happened. Karen stormed off. Her rage wasn't theatrical now, it was frantic. Panicked. I watched her march home, slam her door, and start yelling at someone inside. Maybe her husband, maybe a mirror. Either way, I knew what was coming. She would double down. She'd come back with more papers, more rules, more fake legalese from her lawyer friend who used to work at a courthouse. It was inevitable, but I was ready. That evening, as the sun dipped below the ridge and my landscape lights flickered on like nothing ever happened, I heard another knock at the door. This time it was the HOA's part-time compliance officer, basically a guy with a clipboard and a golf cart, holding a printed fine notice that had been obviously whipped up on someone's inkjet printer. It claimed I owed $5,000 for unauthorized energy sabotage, which, considering I'd spent the day doing nothing more than watching Karen flail around like an angry goose, was kind of flattering. I took the paper, read it silently, and then calmly turned it over. This is blank on the back, I said. Yes, the compliance officer stammered. Good, I replied. It'll make a perfect surface for writing my lawsuit. He blinked. I handed the paper back and closed the door. The next day I made 2 phone calls. The first was to our legal department to report HOA interference and demand that the HOA board be investigated for grid tampering and unauthorized interference with utility infrastructure. The second was to my city contact in code enforcement, asking if they'd like a copy of the footage from my driveway camera, full HD, time-stamped, showing Karen with bolt cutters in hand and a smile wide enough to qualify as a confession. Later that afternoon, Karen's house went dark again. Only this time, it wasn't part of a neighborhood outage. It was just her. My guess? Her system had been jury-rigged by whatever shady contractor she'd hired to cut costs. Now that the grid flagged her as a tampering source, she was isolated by default. No lights, no fridge, no AC. And without my house feeding residual energy back into the shared line, her setup was now as dead as her HOA credibility. She called me 10 times. I didn't answer. I just watched the calls roll in, each one a little more desperate than the last. By sundown, she was outside again, shouting into the void about lawsuits and tyranny and how she would bring the entire HOA to my doorstep. That was fine by me. I had snacks, and I had power. Karen's war began with paper. She might have failed to flip the literal switch on me, but the woman knew how to weaponize office supplies like a ninja with a stapler. The very next morning, I found a glossy, overly dramatic HOA emergency bulletin taped to my mailbox, my front gate, and, because Karen apparently thinks I can't read, a copy wedged under my windshield wiper too. It was titled in all caps, "Urgent, Community Safety Violation by Non-Compliant Resident." Underneath was a blurry, zoomed-in still frame from my security camera footage. The irony? She used the very image that showed her holding bolt cutters and grinning like a maniac as supposed proof of my misconduct. The document was hilariously theatrical, accusing me of engineering an illegal blackout, sabotaging community harmony, and endangering public health and morale. She even claimed I disrupted local bird migration with unregulated power fluctuations. That last one made me laugh so hard I nearly choked on my coffee. But she wasn't done. That afternoon, I got an official-looking envelope hand-delivered by HOA cronies Bob and Linda, Karen's ever-loyal sidekick. It included a $12,500 fine notice, an order of emergency compliance, and a threatening note warning that further resistance would compel the HOA to pursue forced repossession of non-compliant infrastructure. In other words, they wanted to take my legally permitted solar array and backup system. The audacity was almost impressive. I could have burned the paper. I could have yelled. I could have reported them again. But that's not my style. I don't do fire and fury. I do slow burns. The long game. So I smiled, thanked them kindly, and said, "Tell Karen she spelled repossession wrong on page 3. Bob blinked. Linda hissed something about reckless arrogance. Then they left, puffed up like pigeons trying to win a turf war. Karen's next move was even more laughable. She published a full-page tirade in the HOA's monthly newsletter, which is typically reserved for lost pets and plant sale announcements. This time, however, it featured a full column titled, "The Perils of Rogue Residents," complete with ominous warnings about so-called engineers exploiting our trust, and a cartoon graphic of a house exploding with lightning bolts. My name wasn't mentioned, but everyone knew. Neighbors started getting awkward. Some avoided eye contact. Others stopped waving. A few, mostly the ones already sick of Karen's antics, winked at me like I was some sort of folk hero. But the real storm didn't hit until 2 days later. I was in my workshop, upgrading the inverter software on one of my power walls, when I heard the unmistakable hiss of Karen's voice rising outside. I peeked through the blinds. She had gathered nearly a dozen residents in her driveway. There was a folding table, a coffee urn, and a makeshift petition titled, "Remove Non-Compliant Energy Threat from Our Neighborhood." She even brought balloons. Pink ones. Now, if you've never seen an entitled HOA tyrant host an angry mob picnic in 95-degree heat with lukewarm lemonade and a stack of badly spelled protest signs, I envy your innocence. Karen stood on a plastic step stool, shouting about property values, utility sabotage, and the dark future of unchecked energy anarchy. The residents looked half bored, half sweaty. One guy clapped, then stopped when his wife elbowed him. Later that night, the HOA board held an emergency vote at Karen's house. I wasn't invited, of course, but I had a good idea what was discussed. Fines, legal threats, community sanctions. One neighbor even told me Karen was trying to implement a power clause that would force everyone to register their energy systems with her directly. Because, that's not Orwellian at all. The next morning, I received a letter. Not a printed one this time. An actual, handwritten envelope sealed with a red wax stamp. Karen had apparently gone full medieval. Inside was a notice that the HOA had officially voted to impose a lien against my property for compromising public infrastructure. According to her new emergency clause, which passed by board majority, meaning Bob and Linda raised their hands, I owed $25,000 and would face civil litigation unless I complied within 72 hours. That was the moment I escalated. I didn't call the HOA. I didn't call Karen. I called corporate legal. Now, my employer, Pinnacle Utilities, doesn't like its engineers being harassed over infrastructure they built, permitted, and maintained legally. They especially don't like it when HOA Karens illegally cut into live utility lines and then try to financially blackmail employees. So the legal team responded the way any good legal team would, with a 10-page cease and desist letter, followed by an official complaint filed with the city's Utility Oversight Commission. But I wasn't done. I compiled every document Karen had issued. Every letter, every newsletter, every photo she'd stolen from my cameras and slapped on a bulletin board. Then I added footage of her tampering with the power box and screenshots of her emergency clause, which had been written in Comic Sans, by the way. I sent the entire package to my contact at the city's Code Enforcement Division. They were very interested. And then, as if by divine comedy, her house began having power issues of its own. It started with flickering lights. Then half her outlets stopped working. Her sprinkler system shorted out, and a neighbor said he heard something pop when she tried to charge her phone. By the next day, her HVAC had completely died. She was sweating bullets while screaming into her phone on the porch. Here's the twist. The tampering she initiated wasn't just reckless, it broke the internal safety loop in her own power routing. When she ordered her shady contractor to override that solar guy's grid nonsense, they'd effectively bypassed the neighborhood's safe sync protocol. And now? The HOA's system thought her house was a threat. So it cut her off. I saw the city inspector pull up the next afternoon. Clipboard in hand. Bright yellow vest. He looked very serious. Karen met him at the door, all smiles and saccharine lies. But that smile melted in less than 5 minutes. He walked her around the house, pointed at wiring errors, then took her to the community box where her bolt-cutter crime had started. After examining it, he pulled out his phone and started making calls. Karen's face went from pink to purple. Then came the cherry on top. The inspector walked across the street. To me. "Are you Mr. Lennox?" he asked. I nodded. "Sure am. I've been reviewing your permit history and grid layout. Everything checks out. Excellent work, by the way. That's some of the cleanest routing I've seen in years." "Appreciate that," I said with a smile. "Was just trying to keep the lights on. Looks like you're doing a better job than the HOA. He handed me a card. "If she continues harassing you, file it with the Municipal Violations Department. Her wiring alone is enough for a full safety audit." Karen stood across the street, frozen. She must have heard everything. And for the first time, she looked truly terrified. Not angry. Not performative. Just terrified. Because she was starting to realize she hadn't picked a fight with a rogue homeowner. She'd picked a fight with the very system she thought she controlled. That night, her house was dark again. No porch light. No power. Just shadows behind the windows and the occasional flicker of candlelight. And me? I kicked back in my backyard, a cold drink in hand, landscape lights glowing, solar panels soaking up the moonlight like they were in on the joke. I was just getting started. The following morning, I was awakened not by an alarm, but by the clatter of furious knocking on my door, the kind of knocking only desperate people or debt collectors resort to. I shuffled to the front, opened the door, and there stood Karen, her hair frizzed from humidity and fury, her face blotchy with what I hoped was embarrassment but knew was more likely rage. Behind her, her once perfectly pruned flower beds were wilting in the heat. No water. No sprinklers. No functioning circuit. She looked like a villain halfway through her downfall arc, too stubborn to realize it. "You've gone too far," she snapped, skipping the pleasantries. "Morning to you too," I said. "Coffee?" "I'm not here for your smugness," she spat. "You've poisoned the entire HOA against me. My house is under inspection. My power's been flagged as hostile. Do you have any idea what this is doing to my resale value? Considering you threatened to repossess my solar panels 2 days ago, I'd say we're about even." She looked like she was about to scream but paused, holding it back like she was recalculating. "This isn't over. The board still backs me." I leaned against the doorframe. "Does it though? Because Bob just asked me for a quote on installing solar, and Linda told me she's reconsidering her stance on energy autonomy after sweating through a night of 85 degrees without a ceiling fan. Karen flinched. It was a physical reaction, like a punch to the gut. She tried to recover, straightened her spine, and said, "You think you're so smart, with your grid and your smug smile. But I still control this community." I didn't reply. I simply stepped aside and handed her a sealed envelope. The seal bore the insignia of Pinnacle Utilities. She stared at it like it might bite her. "What's this?" she asked. "That," I said, "is a copy of the official utility violation case I filed against the HOA, along with the formal investigation notice you should have received yesterday. They're doing a complete audit, power, infrastructure, permits, contractor licenses. Everything." She blinked, processing. "I also filed with the Department of Public Safety, since cutting power lines is a literal danger to life and property. And, fun fact, the line you cut was technically municipal grade. So, you didn't just mess with me, you messed with the state." She was silent for a long moment. Then she tore open the envelope. She didn't finish reading it. She didn't need to. The opening paragraph made it clear. The utility company was opening an investigation into the HOA's involvement in unauthorized power infrastructure manipulation, illegal tampering with grid systems, and attempted extortion of a utility employee. Her hands trembled. She clutched the envelope like it was the last curtain before the guillotine drop. "This is insane," she whispered. "You're destroying everything." "No," I said calmly. "You're just finally dealing with the consequences of thinking authority means you're untouchable." Karen staggered back down the steps like she'd just been hit with a verdict, and in many ways she had. That afternoon, the real power began shifting. The city dispatched an oversight team to the neighborhood. Not just a single inspector, an entire unit complete with trucks, equipment, clipboards, and high-vis vests. They checked transformers, re-inspected permits, reviewed contractor credentials, and took notes on every house connected to HOA-approved circuit. Meanwhile, the Pinnacle Utilities legal team had begun compiling every documented HOA overreach and cross-referencing it with power fluctuations reported over the last 6 months. As it turned out, Karen's authorized energy vendor had been cutting corners for years. Faulty wiring, overburdened circuits, and, in one case, illegal bypasses that siphoned shared energy into private properties. The city didn't like that. Pinnacle didn't like that. And now Karen's name was at the top of every complaint and every fraudulent authorization slip. At a community meeting hastily organized to discuss the growing public concern, Karen tried to defend herself. She stood at the front of the clubhouse with a stack of papers and her usual manic confidence, claiming the utility company was colluding with rogue residents to undermine HOA unity. But the room was different now. No clap, no nods, just a lot of crossed arms and skeptical looks. I raised my hand. Karen tried to ignore me. Someone else pointed. "Let him speak." She gave me the floor reluctantly, like it physically hurt her. I stepped up, quiet and direct. "I just want to ask one thing," I said. "Can anyone here tell me what Karen's actual qualifications are for making power infrastructure decisions?" The room stayed silent. Has she studied electrical engineering? Held any certification in utility regulation? Been trained in safe routing and code enforcement? Still nothing. I turned to Karen. "So what exactly gives you the authority to cut power lines, demand infrastructure repossession, and impose random compliance fines?" Karen's mouth opened, then shut again. She reached for her papers but found nothing in them to save her. Because there was nothing. She had overstepped, and finally people saw it. The meeting broke down shortly after that. People left in groups, whispering. Some of them stopped by to ask me questions about safe solar installation, about backup batteries, about whether I could recommend someone for upgrade. The tide had turned. Later that evening, I received a notification on my utility dashboard. Karen's home had been officially decoupled from the neighborhood feed, pending a complete safety review. She was now operating entirely off-grid, if she could even get her cobbled-together system to function. I checked my doorbell cam around 10 p.m. and caught a glimpse of Karen pacing on her front lawn with a flashlight, frantically waving it toward the now-dormant utility box like she could magically reactivate it with rage. I watched her rant and storm and yell into her dead phone. And then I called my old friend Trent. Trent's a regional communications director for the state's Utilities Regulatory Authority. We go back to college. I told him the full story, from the bolt cutters to the power clause to the lien threats. "Sounds like you've got a classic HOA tyrant," he said. "Want me to accelerate the audit request?" "Wouldn't hurt," I said. "Especially if we can roll it into the annual compliance report." "You want us to attach it to the grid governance audit?" "Yep." Done. And just like that, the situation wasn't just a local HOA spat. It was now part of a state-level infrastructure review that would require full documentation, legal compliance, and board accountability. Every decision Karen had made was about to be put under a microscope. The next morning, an official notice was posted on the HOA clubhouse door. Leadership review pending, community vote required. The city had intervened. The HOA board was suspended until further notice. An interim committee would be appointed to oversee neighborhood matters while the audit was completed. Karen? She wasn't even invited to the interim discussion. Her role as Vice President of Compliance had been officially deemed non-binding and self-appointed, according to the city's letter. That afternoon, I got another knock. It wasn't Karen this time. It was Bob. He stood there awkwardly, holding a small potted plant like it was a peace offering. "Hey, sorry about the whole everything." I stared at the plant. "It's a fern," he said. "Linda thought it'd help. I took it." "Thanks, Bob." He nodded and left. That night, I sat in my workshop, lights glowing, everything humming quietly around me. My grid feed was stable. My neighborhood was quiet. And for the first time in weeks, there were no threats taped to my mailbox. Karen's house sat in darkness across the street. She wasn't screaming anymore. She was just quiet. The audit wasn't over. But her power was. 3 weeks later, I woke up to the sound of beeping. Not an alarm clock or a coffee machine or anything friendly like that. No, this was industrial. Slow. Repetitive. Mechanical. I rolled over, looked out the window, and saw it, an unmarked white utility truck parked in front of Karen's house. 2 men in orange vests were unloading equipment. One carried a ladder. The other had a lockout kit. A third man in a plain navy jacket with a city inspection badge stood next to Karen on the porch, holding a clipboard while she gestured wildly like a puppet whose strings were all tangled. I got up, poured myself a fresh coffee, and stepped outside to enjoy the show. By now, Karen's yard was a dead zone. Her grass had gone from green to sunburned yellow. The bushes that once looked like manicured hedges now drooped sadly, starved of water and care. The HOA newsletter had stopped printing entirely. The sign at the clubhouse read, "Temporarily closed pending oversight." And Karen herself? She looked like a shadow of the woman who once strutted around here declaring compliance violations like she was Judge Judy. From what I gathered, the inspector was here for the final phase of the audit. Everything from grounding violations to unauthorized transformer access had been reviewed. The city had traced tampering incidents back to Karen's modifications, which included rewiring neighborhood grid links without permits and using unlicensed contractors. Her last Hail Mary had been trying to pass the blame onto those contractors, claiming she had no idea what they were doing. But that defense collapsed when an email surfaced showing Karen ordering them to disconnect the solar rogue and restore HOA order at all costs. The men moved quickly. One climbed the pole and began isolating her property's connection. Another opened the junction box and installed a smart lockout device, a city-ordered failsafe that couldn't be bypassed without official approval. It was a formality, really. Her power was already off. But this was symbolic. Final. Karen saw me watching and turned sharply. For a moment I thought she might come over, try one last desperate plea or throw some bizarre threat about court orders. But instead, she just stared. Her eyes weren't angry anymore. They were exhausted. Like the reality had finally caught up, and her crusade had turned into a grave she kept digging with every swing of her entitlement. The inspector handed her a final warning slip, then walked away. Karen took it and stood in her dead front yard, watching as the truck pulled away. And then she did something I never thought I'd see. She sat down. On the porch. Quiet. That afternoon, I got a call from City Compliance. The investigator, a guy named Paul, thanked me for my cooperation and said the audit had officially concluded. The HOA had been found in violation of multiple municipal codes and utility regulations. The board had been dissolved. Karen, in particular, had been cited for 6 infractions, including utility tampering, property endangerment, and attempted extortion. While the city wasn't pursuing criminal charges, Pinnacle's legal department was, especially for the damage she'd caused to public infrastructure. I asked what that meant exactly. Paul chuckled. Let's just say she'll be seeing courtrooms instead of community centers for a while. 2 days later, I received a letter in the mail. Not from Karen. Not from the HOA. From the city. It was a formal invitation to join the newly proposed Neighborhood Energy Advisory Panel. Apparently, they wanted a technical advisor from the community to help oversee safe infrastructure practices and resident education. I accepted, obviously. Within a week, the HOA was replaced by a smaller, volunteer-run neighborhood council focused on landscaping, trash pickup, and community events. No fines. No secret rules. Just people actually trying to help each other. Funny how much better things run when there isn't someone trying to rule the block like a monarch with a walkie-talkie. Karen's house stayed dark. She didn't show up at the meetings. She didn't speak to neighbors. Occasionally, I'd see her on the porch, scrolling on a phone that likely wasn't connected to anything, a fan plugged into a generator humming weakly in the background. She never made eye contact. Until the moving truck arrived. It was a hot Friday morning, and I was trimming hedges when I saw it pull up. 2 young guys hopped out and started hauling boxes from Karen's porch. No one came to help her. No HOA squad. No Bob. No Linda. Just her, standing awkwardly in the heat, watching pieces of her life get wheeled into a truck that didn't even have her name on the side. One of the movers struggled with a massive plastic tub, wobbling toward the truck like it might explode if he sneezed. I walked over. Need a hand? I asked. The kid looked relieved. Thanks, man. This one's heavy. I grabbed the other end. Together we carried it to the ramp. As we placed it down, Karen emerged behind us. She didn't look angry. She looked hollow. She stood there in silence for a moment, then said, "Why did you do it?" I turned. Do what? All of it. The shutdown. The investigation. The everything. I stared at her. Because you cut my power line, Karen. It wasn't personal, she said weakly. It was illegal. She looked down. I just wanted control. The HOA gave me purpose. Authority. No, I said. It gave you a leash. You thought it was a crown. She didn't respond. Just nodded once. Then walked back inside without another word. The truck pulled out a few hours later. I stood at the curb, watching it disappear down the street. For the first time in months, the neighborhood felt calm. The air lighter. Like we'd all been exhaling under Karen's thumb and finally got to breathe. A week later, the council held its first event, a summer barbecue in the park. I showed up with a cooler of drinks and a portable charger setup for phones and music. Families laughed. Kids played. Linda even brought deviled eggs and didn't say a single word about birds being government spies. Someone asked me if I'd ever consider running for the council board. I laughed. Only if we install panic buttons for when the next Karen shows up. That night, I walked home under warm streetlights powered by the same grid I helped build. Stable, clean, efficient. I passed Karen's old house. It was dark, empty. A real estate sign sat in the lawn, slightly tilted. The porch light bulb had burned out weeks ago. I paused, took one last look, then turned and headed home. Inside, my systems hummed quietly. Battery levels full. Inverter steady. Energy flowing. My home, like my neighborhood, was finally at peace. And the best part? The lights stayed on.